hold your applause because I feel so strongly that I'm so much better on paper than I am in here in presence. My name is Richard Weiss, and I am president of the Explorers Club. I have to admit, this is a very interesting setup here with all the planets. I feel like we should be talking about planetary dominance, and some of our members from the Explorers Club probably would be good at that. My cousin Nina, Dr. Nina Lanza, she's the principal investigator on the Mars Curiosity ChemCam. Did I get it right, Nina? Yes. We don't talk about those things at Thanksgiving dinners and stuff. Hey, listen, how many of you, I know that we have people here from the Explorers Club, right? Can I have just a quick show of hands? Yeah, quite a few. And I know that many of you have never heard of the Explorers Club. And I'll give you a quick explanation of who we are, because you're going to be hearing so many of our speakers later on. The Explorers Club was started in 1904. A bunch of guys at the time trying to be the first to the North Pole and then to the South Pole. And it's interesting, when you walk into the building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, there's a big sign there that our members were the first to the North Pole, South Pole, the top of Everest, to the Marianas Trench, and also walking on the moon. You see some flags here. This is a flag that's symbolic of our members. They take them on a lot of expeditions. But I thought maybe the best way to sort of introduce you to the Explorers Club, I'm going to start with a pop quiz. So, at our centennial dinner a few years ago, we had about 1,500 people, and I asked the audience to please raise their hand if this applied to them. So, I'm going to ask you guys, who here has been to the North Pole? Well, not a bad percentage, same here. At that dinner, about 250 people raised their hands. And then I asked who had been to the South Pole, and that's Amundsen, one of our members. Anybody here been to the South Pole? Again, not bad for such a small audience. Anybody been to Everest? Okay, there, okay, great, not bad. At that dinner, Sir Edmund Hillary raised his hand along with I'd say about 75 other people that evening. Anybody been to the Marianas Trench, to the bottom? That's a tough one, just a handful of people. At that dinner, Don Walsh, who recently passed away, had raised his hand, and that is a place that really too many people have been. Okay, I'm going to go a little further out. Who here has been to space? Okay, right here. We have Gopi here, who yesterday got engaged, but also, yeah, that's a big thing. Gopi, correct me if I'm wrong on this. You are the first Indian-born Indian to travel to space. Is that correct? That is correct. So we have a historic. Gopi, stand, please. Anybody been to the moon? Because at that dinner we had, I think, Buzz Aldrin had raised his hand, and Al Warden, who had been there, had raised his hand. So I think at this point there's been 10 people to the moon, and all of them are Explorer Club members. In fact, Neil Armstrong took the Explorers Club flag to the moon, and recently his son, Mark, brought it back to the Explorers Club to donate. And one of the things I really love about the community of the Explorers Club are the conversations you have that about little historic snippets that you don't read about. And I said, Mark, when you first saw your dad, they were in those quarantine booths. What did your dad say to you? And he said, you boys been mowing the lawn? And so, it wasn't anything sort of deep and thing. It's just the typical dad-son experience. But, the one thing that, and I noticed this side of the room, a lot of you didn't raise your hand. The one thing that you can participate in is curiosity. And I have to tell you that, human beings have been addicted to storytelling, since the beginning of time, since people came out of caves, that and I think dancing. And I always say, if I could actually dance, I would have been married probably 10 years earlier. I can't dance. Any stereotype you have of people dancing, that is me. But you can really participate in curiosity And really, the questions of always why. Like, millions of people saw an apple fall to the ground. Newton asked why, right? And, that's one of the things. The other aspect of exploration, and I think this is so much at the heart of what the Explorers Club is trying to do, I feel that we need to represent the fabric of a culture or global citizenship. It's not just American, it's not just European. It is really everybody in the world. We have a program at the Explorers Club called the EC50. It means 50 people who are changing the world that the world needs to know about. It was, and really, the program was to introduce new people to the club. All of us, when we travel, you often say, I met the most incredible person. And that's usually where the conversation ends. And we felt that, within our membership, we had to have people break the mirror of self-reflection and nominate other people. So I think we have some EC50 people in this room. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these are people who are changing the world, who you'll probably hear a little later on. This is J.R. Harris. He's a member of the club. He's African American. And he once said to me, you tend not to do something that you don't see other people like you doing. And he said when he was younger, he was a solo hiker, and he'd go on the Appalachian Mountain Trails. It's very long, goes from Georgia to Maine. And he said that he'd be walking through the woods, and people just weren't used to coming up on a black man walking through the woods. And so this whole idea that I think, because if you ask me what I think the future of exploration, it's going to be communicating. And I think in order to communicate effectively, you're going to have to see people you identify with. There's 5,000 languages spoken on Earth, but there are universal languages too. There's music, art, dance, nature, food, and I think all of those are important. And I think, as I said, not all explorers look the same. Now, here's the issue we're all facing, and I feel like this is of the utmost importance. If there's one thing, that I want you to come away with, is the whole idea of communication. Now, how many of you have had somebody say, I don't believe people have walked on the moon? That's stunning. That is a stunning admission. I had an Uber driver recently telling me about a lot of other theories and about people not walking on the moon. But at that same dinner in which I introduced all of those concepts of who's been to the North Pole and who's been to the South Pole, during the dinner, I was just about to introduce Buzz Aldrin. And when you're looking at a big crowd, there were 1,500 people, and you can always tell like one face that's different. And this guy was charging this landing on the moon was a hoax. And it's interesting, you see that napkin in my hand? I didn't know what to do, so I had to really think like this. I thought, if this guy's trying to shoot Buzz Aldrin, I've got to cut off his vision with a napkin in front of his face. So the guy grabs my hand, and I couldn't believe it. I'm like, security, come up here. And the guy bit my hand. So I took one for Buzz Aldrin. But I think it is so important. Oh my gosh, if there's one thing I want you to get out of this whole lecture is it's so incumbent on us, on all of us, to make science relevant, that it's not just a theory. I mean, we're looking at all these planets that are sort of going around the sun. That shouldn't be a new concept. I mean, you don't hear about the Flat Moon Society, right? But we hear about other things. In order to communicate that, I feel so strongly the idea of us having other people do things. Be curious. Go out into the woods, look at something. People always apologize to me and they say, I haven't been to the North Pole, I haven't been to the moon, I just live in whatever area I am. Watch birds. That's something you can collect, a bird list that you don't actually have to go someplace. Be curious about something. You don't have to have a PhD to be a scientist. And I was just at the memorial of Jane Goodall just this past Wednesday in Washington, DC, and the overwhelming, view or thought or what people said is hope. Hope. Jane Goodall believed in hope. Jane Goodall also believed in the goodness of humans and our ability to really find solutions for things. I'm so happy that we're at this Dubai Future Forum because I think there are people here who are generally interested in hearing ideas, have hope and optimism. And, so many of us will say, well, gosh, I can't quite do it because I might have some sort of obstacle. This is Junior. I met Junior at a wedding in Maine. Maine is a state in the United States. And as you can see, Junior had a cart. I was at a wedding and this dog just sort of showed up. I met the owners subsequently and I got to know them. But Junior was the most optimistic dog I've ever seen. He would chase seagulls, play with other dogs, fetch things. He overcame things. And, I look at Junior and I see optimism. So, I hope you understand a little more about what our goal at the Explorers Club, because you're going to be meeting a lot of speakers. This flag doesn't just represent discovery or optimism. It also represents excellence, the best in the human conditions. So again, I look forward to you hearing some of the other speakers today. Have a chance to speak with them. I am internally optimistic that we can solve some of the problems of the future. And I thank this audience for hearing a little story about the Explorers Club. Thank you.
Panel now. Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard, for that wonderful introduction to the Explorers Club. And I'm delighted to now introduce almost immediately our next panel. Can I? Yeah. There we go.
Thank you. Not made for short people.
I am a substitute. And they say one of the characteristics of an explorer is be able to adapt to a changing environment. And we had one of our speakers.
Absolutely, that's right. My name is Aaron. I'm the moderator for this next panel, which is going to be about how the past can teach us about the future. And I love how it follows on almost directly from the spirit of what you shared, Richard, because you were sharing so much about how we explore the current world and in a lot of ways the potential that has for the future. This panel will explore the past, that area that we probably ought to know a lot better, but we don't, at least not quite enough. We've got two wonderful panelists, as you can see. Richard is subbing in for Roy Casagranda, and thank you so much, Richard, for doing that at short notice. We really appreciate the agility and the flexibility, which are, of course, great qualities of all good futurists. And we've also got Salima Ikram joining us here, Distinguished Professor of Egyptology at the American University of Cairo. So could you give them both a warm round of applause, please, and welcome them. So, like I said, we're going to be looking at the issue of time and the interrelationship between past, present, and future today. And I just wanted to start with a quick story. So I teach at Oxford University. And there was once we were walking down the street, some friends and I, and there was a big tour group right in front of us. And there was this little boy, probably about 10 years old, so not much younger than you, Richard, given your youthful energy, who suddenly looked up to the tour guide and said, this building here, is it pre-war? And then the tour guide looked at him and said, young man, it is pre-America, right? Which was a wonderful little encapsulation, I think, of quite how far back time stretches, right, given our own living memories. And today, this is an incredibly humbling panel for me because, I work in a university that's 900 years old, but even that is really a blip in the larger tapestry and weaving of history that's out there. And what I hope we can explore today with both of you is quite how much the past teaches us about the future and the present, and also whether we are open to learning those lessons. So let's start with a quick introduction. You've probably read both of their bios, but Salima, especially, I wanted to ask you, tell us one thing that's not in your bio already.
A horrible addiction to reading mystery stories.
Excellent. And that's probably not unrelated to the study of history, I would think, where you are solving historical novels and historical puzzles all the time.
Constantly.
Wonderful. And Richard, you've had 15 minutes of a keynote already, but tell us something else that we don't know about you.
I start every morning probably about 5:30. I have a golden retriever that runs into my room, 2 cats, and then at 6 a.m. I get children up. And so, I start my day really early, but I think to me one of the joys, we talk about traveling so far, but I think I really enjoy being home. I really enjoy being married, having children, and I think that's probably the greatest adventure I've ever been on.
Brilliant. And I think again there is a wonderful link to history, right? Because if we believe T.S. Eliot that the end of all our exploring is to return where we started and know the place for the first time, then we are actually coming home even in the discoveries of history.
Just like Ibn Battuta, one of the
Exactly.
great historians who traveled all over the world and then was so relieved to get home.
Excellent. So this actually is a wonderful segue into the first question I wanted to pose to you both, which is we often talk about the influence of the past on the present, but much less about the effect of the past on the future. Does the past help us to think about new possibilities in better ways? Does it help us to conceptualize of change in new ways? Those of us who do futures might be aware of this activity we like to do called shared histories, where we get a group together, and before they even discuss the future, they start discussing what's changed in the last 20 years. For them as individuals, for the world they live in, for their country, for their region, for their city and town. And once they've done that, they suddenly realize so much has changed in 20 years, so what more can we expect in the next 20? So the question I have for both of you is, what's your favorite story about how the past has affected your view of the future, either of what is possible or in terms of lessons that you might have learned? Salima, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I think being an Egyptologist, I'm a bit obsessed and monothematic, but I think the whole thing about the pyramids certainly has affected how I view the current, present, and the future. Because for the Egyptians, I mean, although most Egyptians go, yeah, the pyramids, yeah, we know them, they're there, but when it comes to making a decision about the future, it has a huge impact because they're like, we did something. We can do something. And it is a great moment for people to sort of unify themselves and think beyond the individual to a collective, to a possibility of what can be achieved. And recently we had the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum. Do come and visit. But I mean, that too was a moment where people felt a sense of national pride. It's near the pyramids, but also constantly evoked, not just by the government and, the propaganda machine, but by individuals in the street saying, look, we did something great once and we are still capable. So it's a moment of hope and it's a moment for thinking of the future and what can be achieved in these times of crisis.
Yeah. And especially at the level and the scale, right, at which the Egyptians managed to do those achievements. Yes. Richard.
I think apprenticeship of skills, so many people are always looking for the shortcuts of any job. And I think that if you look at the Shackleton expedition, that was an expedition that was at the turn of the 20th century where a great deal of men should have died on an expedition. But because they all knew their jobs and their skills, everybody survived. If at this point, we can go anywhere in the world in 24 hours. You could be at Everest Base Camp, and we see so often people go to Mount Everest and suddenly, things go wrong and they're no longer able to take care of themselves. I had a friend who was on Mount Everest and he was just the beginning of the death zone at 26,000 feet. And he got into his tent and he knew he had to take his boots off, but he started to cry because he said he couldn't remember how to do it. And that's that whole idea that, man, like if you asked to tie your shoelaces, almost all of us, unless you're 20-something where you grew up on Velcro, you could all tie your shoelaces in the most, comatose state.
Yeah.
And that apprenticeship of skills should be like that. And I think there really is something to be said about knowing a job backwards, forwards, what everyone else does to be able to and I think by understanding that, it allows you to innovate more because you really understand the product in its totality.
And it's the whole thing of, the working together and knowing the cogs.
Well, it's interesting you say that because last night...
Team sport that's involved here, isn't it?
Yeah, but we heard a talk at dinner. It was a good talk about, working with people who are difficult. Yes. And I will say one of the biggest human instincts is your gut. How often have you met somebody and you're like, ugh. And, because we're all well-mannered people, you try to make it work out, but it always comes around to that circle. And so the oldest instinct of human being is that gut feeling that we override. And I think your gut is really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I want to probe a bit more for both of you, because the units of analysis that you seem to be both working with are quite different here, right? Salima, you're thinking about the grand sweep of history, and the civilization is almost the unit that you're thinking about here. Whereas your stories, Richard, have been about the individual, right? That heroic individual almost who's led these really interesting explorations and helped us to carve out new boundaries. What other units of analysis must we all keep in mind as good thinkers and practitioners about the future, besides both the individual and the civilization? What happens in between? Do you want to start us off?
Well, yeah, I will. So we have a member. His name is Joe Rohde. A lot of people over here know him. He was the chief Imagineer at Disney. And he was also one of the chief architects of that program, the Explorers Cup 50. And so he introduced a term that's called smooth friction. And when we talk about when we get in a collaborative group, everybody thinks, oh, well, I need to have opposing viewpoints. And he said, no, you don't want people opposing what you're doing. What you really want to do is have people with different perspectives. So we may take somebody, if say we were planning this, I might take somebody who's a geologist, I may take somebody who's a sculptor, and everybody comes to it. They're trying to create the same thing, but they're adding to the equation by giving the perspective of the lens through their eyes. So for me, that was a very important lesson that I learned from Joe, and I apply it to so many group dynamics now.
Nice. Yeah, and I love the idea of smooth friction as well, because a lot of times foresight work is all about creating space within which friction and discomfort can be felt constructively, right? So that smooth friction gives us a way of managing that whole process.
The whole thing can be worked through. But I mean, it's also external factors sometimes that serve as stimuli.
Right.
And that, I think, is also, for a historian, another thing to take into account. But in this way, with your smooth friction, you are actually creating that by having people with so many different perspectives. So it's not necessarily an external major event, though in terms of the broad sweep of history, sometimes it's an innovation, one tiny innovation like the nail, or something a bit grander like the wheel, that does in fact change how people interact, how they work together, and what they come up with in a collaborative way as an idea that is going to then, thousands of years in the future really change how we do things. And I mean, that's one thing with history that I really like, is that a tiny innovation has such a long range effect, the ripple effect that we have.
Right. So I want to build on this idea of ripples, actually, because there are lots of metaphors for how history influences the future, right? We often talk about the line of history, or circles, or cycles, or repeating cycles, even paradigm shifts in the Kuhnian and Popper kind of style, which is what the nail and then presumably the wheel managed to help us do.
Right.
But which of these for you, for both of you, right, is the most resonant image for how the past influences the present and the future? Are we dealing with cycles here, or is it a line? Or does it look like a line, but is it actually something else?
I mean, I believe in the ascension of humankind. And it isn't always apparent, because we say, especially when you see wars, that we repeat the same mistakes. But what made Alexander the Great great, I no longer think is great, right? Conquering other people. And so I do believe in the ascension of humankind. But you were talking about paradigm shifts. When I was a child, I was taught that there were 9 planets, and even one of those planets isn't a planet anymore. That's a whole other
that was paradigmatic
argument, and life existed between a narrow shift. So we have this conversation often about people saying, oh, I can't believe science, I can't believe these doctors, because one year you tell us one thing and the other you're telling us something else. It's not about me being right or wrong. It's about, essentially finding the truth. And if a path leads you to a different opinion on something, you have to be open enough to say, I'm getting closer to a truth, instead of being dogmatic about, what you might have been taught earlier on. So it's that whole idea of personal flexibility.
Which links to the curiosity point you brought up earlier as well, right? If we approach life and the past with curiosity, then we're far more likely to be able to have that flexibility of opinion.
But curiosity is also fun, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know this is a curious group, and I've been on trips with this thing. People get so jazzed about like the smallest thing, like they'll start seeing a counter, and now they'll start going over its geologic history.
Fossils.
and fossils, right? Or stars, or how this building, the engineering.
Yeah.
I think to walk around with that kind of wonderment and with information at our touch is so exciting, and it makes you, there's always something new where you're like, wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
It's the whole idea of questioning, because in EC in Lisbon, as we were walking up the stairs, suddenly 3 people stopped, riveted, because of course there were fossils in the stone in the floor. And so that was, half an hour of discussion, heated, but it was great.
I'm surprised it was only half an hour, Salima.
Well, it was only because he rounded us up.
Right.
But
Back to the question then, what's for you your favorite metaphor about time here?
The thing is that with time, with scholars, you sort of get married to one theory, and that is a problem, because I think you have to be flexible. There has to be nuance, so you can have the linear view of time or the cyclical view of time, which to some extent works, because we do keep repeating the same mistakes, but then we do break out of it. So it's sort of a combination of punctuated equilibrium and a cyclical kind of thing, because I think it's tied into human nature. Because one of the things that, as Richard has been pointing out, is we are human. We have a shared experience, and no matter what happens with all the technology, the essence is the same. And so we have to work with what we are. And then when you are looking at historical paradigms, the cycles of what happens, it is, in the end, based on human beings.
So if you had to pick, though, is there a favorite metaphor?
No, I don't like to pick.
You don't like to?
I hate
This is the
multiple
classic
choice
scholar
thing.
method.
It's like,
Yes.
give me an essay, don't give me multiple choice.
Absolutely. Multiple choice tells you really not very much about anybody's ways of thinking. But I want to pick up on something that Salima said, which is, that we can sometimes end up repeating, right, the mistakes of history. I do wonder, I have to say, do we really learn from history, whether it's for the past or for the future? If you look at things like, the pandemic recently, right? I mean, have we really learned the lessons of the pandemic? I mean, whether it was about masking or, healthy hand-washing practices or social and safe distancing, I'm not sure we have. And I wonder sometimes whether humankind, unless it's a deeply dire sort of emergency, we don't actually end up learning from history. But tell me your views on that.
We don't always internalize it, but when the pandemic hit, I went out and I got Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year.
Right.
I don't know how many of you have read that, but it was extraordinary. As I read it, that was going on hundreds of years ago, but it was following exactly the same pattern that COVID did. And what was going on, how people were reacting. This was, 300 years later, but it was all the same thing, and it's as if no one had internalized, learned, or written it down and said, here, guys, this is what you should not do, this is what you should do. Having said that, I do think that there is a bit of a learning curve, but it doesn't always work.
I look at the plague, and that's a good example. The plague. I look at the pandemic. Plague is something else, right?
Yeah.
But even look at the plague of Europe when half the population died. I think that, again, the skepticism was born out of we were looking at this in real time. Scientists were trying to make the best assessment with the information at hand. And I think that how rapidly they developed vaccines.
Extraordinary.
And you can argue of social distancing and all that other stuff, in hindsight. But, my grandmother in 1919, when there was the Spanish flu in New York, where she lived, her mother died and millions of people died. We didn't have that same thing. So I think that, I'm very impressed by how science reacted to it and the information. Now, there's other things about political sort of use of it that I don't admire. Right. But I think, as science and scientists as a whole really have a lot to be proud of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. Yeah, go on.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the science certainly moved forward.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting if people themselves could just internalize certain habits for not just disease, but other things as well.
I suppose self-testing is one of those things we do much better now than we did before the pandemic, right? We don't assume that we have to go see a doctor for every single thing that happens to us. There is more that an individual is able to do at a democratic level. Yeah, but I want to also pick up on something both of you have now alluded to, which is you've both looked at history before and thought, I recognize that. I recognize myself in that, right? Things actually haven't changed that much. Tell us a bit about an example of that, whether it's to do with looking at the ancient Egyptians and saying, oh, I recognize 21st century society in that, Salima, or in the explorations that you've done, Richard.
I mean, certainly in terms of people's habits, in essence, although we have all the same technology, as Richard was describing, what does he do when he gets up? We all have a certain amount of having to deal with our bodies, but it's been fascinating going on the first floor and seeing some of the innovations that people are coming up with to change how our bodies are even working, putting in those contact lenses forever that changes how you see. It's a very humbling experience to see the advances of science for the betterment of everyone, inshallah. I mean, we have someone in the Explorers Club also who has been working on prosthetic limbs, making it go from, $15,000 to $750, which makes things more affordable. So I think changes like that are certainly to be applauded. And we, our own selves, I think in the end, we are human, so there is a certain element of behavior pattern. So when you read the Odyssey or the Iliad, and you see Achilles behaving like a bad-tempered 5-year-old and sulking, and you can be in a department meeting at the university and you say, oh, that hasn't changed much.
And is there an Achilles heel in that human being in that case that you can shoot at?
Oh,
One always hopes.
yeah, but I mean, you look. It's funny you mentioned the Odyssey. The movie's coming out this summer. I'm looking forward
yes.
to seeing
That's right.
it.
There's
They
new
say the book
pictures
is
emerging
better.
now.
But I think that if you look at human nature, there are certain recurring themes of jealousy, of love, of curiosity. We
Greatness.
spoke of that. But if you ask me to say what would be our superpower to sort of move into the future, and I didn't come up with this. I actually heard it at one of our recent talks. There was a young filmmaker, and she said that her weakness when she was younger is that she used to get so worried about forests being cut down, animals being killed, and her psychiatrist said you shouldn't have so much empathy for things. And she said that in the end, empathy became her superpower. And when you see her filmmaking, you can see just her detail to the human condition.
Yeah.
And I think that, while we all have pride on where we come from, our cultures, I think that when we realize the sameness, the whole idea of, I don't care where you're from, that whole idea of getting the kids out, fed, it goes across all boundaries. And I think that as a species, I think our superpower could be empathy if we choose to accept that.
And I think that's also what's important about history.
Yeah.
Because it's not just your one nation, your one even personal history. It is something that is shared across humanity.
Yep.
And that's what makes us sane and empathetic to one another. And that's why when we are doing things like major expeditions and exploring, they're all sort of behind this common goal regardless of who the individual is. And I think that is really important. And that kind of binding together is what makes us move forward as a species.
So I have a question for you both about AI and technology more broadly, because no panel these days is complete without at least one question on artificial intelligence, right? So here's my question. Futurists approach technology often as this deeply transformative force, right? That it's something that is going to change everything in how we function. It's going to change human behavior. When the internet first became a thing, someone called John Perry Barlow wrote something called the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, where he addressed the governments, right, the weary giants of flesh and steel that he felt were going to become defunct in a world that was now much more democratized with distributed authority structures. And now with AI and in its generative form especially, we're thinking a lot more about how that might end up happening. But there are other sources of evidence that suggest that we adopt technology not as it is, but as we are. Right? We adopt it in ways that reinforce our inequalities, our biases, our predilections. From your experience, right, whether it's looking at applications of technology in ancient Egypt or applications of technology in the different explorations you've seen, are we adopting it in truly transformative ways, or is there reason to believe that actually that there is actually a reinforcement happening rather than change?
Well, first I'm going to make a statement about ChatGPT. it's a kiss ass.
It really is. I've been
know?
told so many times that I'm very intelligent and ask good questions.
It's
Yeah.
like, I'm thinking of walking barefoot across the tundra. And it would go, great idea, let me, give you a map, right? So I think that, look, it's here, the genie is out of the bottle. You'd be a fool not to use it. And I think that perhaps it has a better turn of phrase, or this morning I couldn't figure out how to turn my Nespresso machine on. So I took a picture and I said, ChatGPT, where is the on button on this thing? And so I had my cup of coffee. I think I'm happy also that I grew up before the internet. And because I think, nature was my guide, and boredom was something that motivated me to do something. And I think that you'll find in the future that people are going to start in the same way they do exercise, look at nature as nourishment. I think if you're a knowledge junkie like this audience is, it's great to just be able to Google or ChatGPT something, and you get the answer.
Yep.
That's great. Use it. But I think you have to sort of express the other parts of being human, and walking out in nature is one of them. And being bored is actually a motivator for learning other things.
And an enabler. I mean, I get my best ideas when I'm bored. Yeah. Salima.
Well, I mean, it was really interesting listening to some of the talks this morning about how potential cabinet members could be AI generated, yes. Which, I mean, pardon the expression, but it depends on what your AI is trained in. Shit in, shit out. So you have to be very careful about it. I, of course, teach. So for me, it's a constant struggle because I have students who no longer are engaging their brains. They're just putting in a question, sometimes a good question, sometimes a bad question, into ChatGPT. It comes out. Sometimes they rephrase it a bit. Generally, they don't. And I think there are a lot of good things it can do. AI has a lot of power for good. It can be transformative. But on a day-to-day level, it worries me so much because people are giving up their autonomy. They are turning themselves into perfect sheep to be manipulated. And this scares me because you're giving up the idea of independent thought, of self-expression, of analysis, of critical thought. And this can lead to a exaggeration of 1984 pretty quickly. On the other hand, there are a lot of good applications one can use. Sometimes, as you said, just within our scholarship, we can scan in hundreds of pictures of random blocks with sculptural fragments and say, yo, put it together after it's been trained on pictures of complete walls. And then instead of our spending 10 years and lots of grant money on a slightly useless exercise of putting this together, we can have it done in a few hours or a few days and then use that to move forward in our understanding of ancient Egyptian art, history, religion, culture, what have you.
Lovely. Thank you both for that reminder. Because a lot of what you're saying is really that the meaning-making work and the value judgments that need to come in the processes that we put in place must be done by humans, right? Not by some kind of automated process that is a bit of a kiss ass, as Richard reminded us. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to do a couple of rapid-fire questions with the two of you. So these can be 30-second replies, slightly longer if you feel like it, but hopefully not too much longer. Favorite thinker, favorite scholar in the work that you've done that you think everybody here should be reading? Apart from each other. Yeah.
And you.
Yes.
No, I mean, for us, Jan Assmann is a great thinker, and he has written about how the past is curated. How do we present the past to inform the present and also to influence the future? Because, of course, the past has been a powerful tool in propaganda machines and by governments. So I think that is, as well as, of course, in the creative cycles. You look at the past, you come up with a new idea. Look at this amazing structure that we're in, which has elements from different cultures, different bits of history. So I think that Jan Assmann is one, and the other one is James Burke, who wrote a wonderful, and there was a TV series called Interconnections, and it's how about, some one thing that happened maybe 10 years ago, or generally 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, influence the flow of history, and it really emphasizes the interconnections between people as well as between innovations.
Great.
For me, I get, as president of the Explorers Club, I come across a lot of great thinkers. I really do. And I've been so, I never use this word, but blessed to sit in the cars. I remember sitting in a car, in a taxi once with this guy, Al Ward, and he was Apollo 15. Some of you remember Al, he passed away just recently. And he was telling me, I told him that one of my favorite things growing up was standing on my lawn with my father. He was a pilot, learned celestial navigation, talking about the stars. And he said to me when he was coming back from the moon, which is always a great way to start a conversation, he said that he was afraid they would lose coordinates like Apollo 13 and wouldn't be able to find their way back. And he said without telling NASA, he decided to use his 8-inch window and chart his own course back from the moon to Earth, just using celestial navigation.
Yeah.
And when you hear that, you just say, oh my gosh, the people who did these missions were so brilliant. But so often, someone in your life who's a mentor, somebody you look up to, may not be famous. I was very lucky that I have an uncle, Dr. Richard Lanza, Nina's father, and we come from Italian immigrants. Our family was not educated, and my uncle, was head of MIT's nuclear physics department, a smart guy, right? But his superpower is he could explain anything to anybody at their level. They didn't feel patronized. He's genuinely curious. He's a good storyteller. So for me, he was always the benchmark of a smart person. And a smart person is not just like Elon Musk firing neurons, but it's somebody who's smart is also able to read the room and to identify. So for me, it was a lot closer to home to have somebody as that presence in my life. And that, I take away so much from just watching that person.
Yeah, that image of charting course via the celestial figures is a really wonderful one for foresight as well, actually.
Oh my
There's a lot of
God, I
practitioners.
just got goosebumps. On that one, I honestly said to him, what is the world record for goosebumps? Because I just got them.
Yeah, and a lot of us who do this foresight work will often find that, in the image is that when you don't have maps anymore, you're dealing with a terrain that can't be mapped. Your most useful tool actually at that point is a compass and the stars, right, more than anything else, because those are what allow you to chart your way ahead, rather than try and figure things out in a purely analytic sort of way. Okay, next question for you both. All of us deal with concepts in our work, right? Mathematicians have things like symmetry and differential calculus and gradients. Different scientists will have different sets of ideas out there. What's one concept from your work that you think everybody here should know about so that they can study the future better and make the future better?
Well, that's a tough one.
That's a tough one. I'm going to say that, and I don't know if I'm giving anything that's breakthrough, but it's the whole idea of human interactions, how we really bring out the best in people, and I think it goes back to that empathy. But I just found that 3 cups of tea or sharing a meal or breaking bread, that's proverbial breaking bread. You can cut around so much distrust from people, and I think once you get around, feeling like there's this barrier between you, that's when the real collaboration starts. Yeah. So last night, again, I'm sorry I keep bringing up the speaker. He's talking about working with people you don't trust. Yeah. And I said to the people at the table, don't. And that's the Sicilian in me coming out.
That's your gut.
That's my gut. Yeah.
I love it. And this links really to the point you made about shared history earlier on as well, right? The history isn't just macro history, but that shared micro history that we develop with one another is actually so important in shaping our perceptions of the future. Salima.
Well, I would agree with Richard, but also let me call upon the ancient Egyptians. They have a wonderful idea, which was core to their belief system, which is called ma'at. Ma'at means balance, order, and sort of keeping chaos at bay. But this was each person's responsibility. So you had a code of behavior, not just towards one another, other human beings, but also to the natural world. And so the whole point was to try and maintain a good balance. So it's a give and a take. And that is something that kept the ancient Egyptian civilization basically in balance and surviving for over 3,000 years. So you can see that it can work. And this is something that maybe we should try and internalize and think about balance. So a give and a take between each other, but also paying more attention to the earth and nature as well as the celestial parts of our existence.
But don't you think that what the ancient Egyptians, if we look at our life, like the one benefit of like COVID was we weren't overscheduled, right?
Yeah.
Do we look back at this century and say those people were crazy, right? They had no balance. And so, maybe that's a lesson that, with the ancient Egyptians, because I think a lot of civilizations, Eastern civilizations, they always talk about the yin and yang and the balance.
And balance.
I think when we look back at our century, we may say that we were like the proverbial chicken without our heads.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing we'll look back to is people will say, I can't believe you treated animals the way you...
So badly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really nice. And that links nicely the concept of ma'at, actually. I think in the second panel this morning, we heard the idea of kaitiaki, right? The guardianship that comes out of the Pacific approaches to future, but also just the general custodianship and stewardship that they deal with. I suspect there are lots of resonance between the two concepts there. Yeah. All right, in the last 5 minutes, one last question for you both. This may be the hardest one yet, but I think I'm going to have a lot of fun watching you deal with this. Not squirm. But what's one... If you think back in the last 100 years or so, right, what's been a global development? Anything you like. It could be a really micro development or a macro development. What's one thing that happened in the world where you looked at it and thought, if only we had known our history better, we could have done that differently? So I'm asking you to think quite counterfactually here. What's one example of that, and what is the thing that we could have done better in that particular instance? Take a minute to think about it if you need. Yeah.
I'm getting very unscientific, and I'm going to say this, and it's not meant to be a kiss-ass answer to half our audience here, but I think if I say what has been the biggest paradigm shift, it's women's rights. I think the utilization of women within society, and even culturally. It wasn't so long ago, you talk about Oxford, you had to be of a certain type to
Absolutely. And gender, if you go even a little bit further back.
Yeah. Oxford.
Gender, definitely.
And so we're really utilizing humanity in its whole. When you look at a group of people and say, no, you cannot be educated, or, this is not the role of a woman. And so the obstacles that women had in education 100 years ago are not the same. I'm not saying it's equalized in all parts of the world, but I think that is, to me, the biggest shift of utilization of a full span of human population versus just the right type of person.
Okay, so that's one thing we did well.
I think that was, I would definitely agree with that, obviously, on many counts, and looking around this room.
Yeah.
But I have a question. Do you think that we are maintaining that, or do you think that there are issues now that are being counter to this shift?
You mean, are we trying to make women great again?
Are we trying to make men
reverse
great
that.
again?
Exactly, yes.
I was thinking we were trying to make men great again, because I might be feeling a bit insecure now.
I don't know if you're the again, honestly, there, Salima.
I'm being
Will
kind.
we ever?
No, but I'm being kind.
So that is a good question. So what happens is, in a control situation, the oldest trick in the book in terms of people control is they say your life would be great if not for, right?
Yeah.
If not for people of other color being in Oxford, or if not for women taking on the job market, if not for the decadent West, if not for the religious East.
Or
Everybody
immigrants doing whatever.
Yeah, whatever that stuff,
jobs.
and I see the and now I'm getting political, but I see the rise of the dictator, where people are utilizing their worst fears. I mean, if we learned anything in history, you look at the Nuremberg trials. I just saw the movie.
There we go.
Is that you always set up the scapegoat? Man, your life would be great if not for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is quite interesting because it's happening not just in one place. It seems to be a sea change.
Did this happen in ancient Egypt, Salima?
to some extent. We always had the vile Cushites, then we had the Egyptians were wonderfully ethnocentric. But on the other hand, if you came to Egypt and you started to walk, eat, talk like an Egyptian, then it didn't matter what you looked like. You were Egyptian.
Interesting.
It was all it was people who weren't like us.
Right. So there's some amount of assimilationist tendency.
There was a lot of assimilation tendency.
Yeah. Well, look, as with all good panels, we've got to the point where there's probably lots of new questions that are coming up, but we do have to end. I want to thank you both so much for sharing the recurring themes that you've seen in your work, the shared history that's out there, and ultimately, sharing with us and modeling what smooth friction can look like, right? And where different perspectives come together, vastly different in this case, how
Our
much we
friend
can learn
Joe
from the
Rody will
past.
be very happy we mentioned him.